Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we are going to attempt to do 2 chapters in 70 Faces. For those who have the book, it will be chapters 17 and 18. And the first one is about divisions between words, verses, and Parshiot. And the second one will be about the musical cantillation that we chant or sing the Torah. So for those who have your books open, it's chapter 17, page 159. And the important thing to point out here is that in the Torah itself, there's no vowels, there's no musical cantillation, and there's no division between sentences. There's no commas, there's no periods, there's no question marks, there's no exclamation points. So the question is, how do we know when a verse begins and when it ends? So obviously this is really important to be able to read the Torah. So there's a discussion in the Talmud in the Darim 37b as to, well, where did the divisions come from? And there's a whole discussion, and there's different opinions if it goes all the ways back to Moshe at Sinai, if it was from Ezra, in other words, just people knew how to read it, or was it from Ezra who made it clear? But the final opinion seems to be that it was all the ways back from Moshe at Sinai, and that along the way until Ezra, we're talking about approximately 900 years. A lot of things get lost in the translation in 900 years, and that Ezra had the tradition and he reestablished it. And then about 1,000 years ago, there were a group of sages who set, like when we open up a printed Chumash and we see the verses and we see the vowels and we see the cantillation, it was officially like stamped, which is what called the Masoretic tradition. That's about 1,000 years ago. So it went through like 3 different stages. Moshe from Sinai, renewed and formalized at the time of Ezra, and a final stamp of approval from about 1,000 years ago, the Masoretic text. So we're going to take some of the examples of what we're talking about here. And I think we discussed last week that the actual chapters that we all quote, chapter and verse, is a Christian thing. It's not the natural Jewish way of dividing, let's call it the Parshiot, the paragraphs. So that we're not dealing with tonight so much, but we're dealing more with how do we know when one parsha begins and one parsha ends? How do we know when a verse begins and a verse ends? And even within a word, you can divide a word in different ways. So we're going to start with a unique phenomenon, is that every Torah portion, there's at least 9 spaces between the end of one parsha and the beginning of another, except there's one exception. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to start the last parsha of the book of Genesis is Vayechi. This is telling about Yaakov's last 17 years in Egypt and the blessings he gives to his children, and he passes away, and then Yosef passes away, and the book of Genesis ends. That parsha is called a parsha stuma, a closed parsha. For those who want to see what is written, it's on page 161. But of course, we always add to it. So this parsha, though, there is no space between the end of the previous Parsha, which is Parshat Vayigash, and Vayechi. And therefore, it's called a closed Parsha, Parsha Stuma. Rashi brings two opinions why this is a unique, there's no other Parsha that's like that you can't obviously see when the Parsha begins. So why is it called a closed Parsha? So Rashi brings two opinions. One is because with the passing away of Yaakov and Yosef, he says the hearts and the minds of Israel were closed because of the exile and the slavery that was about to happen. He brings a second opinion that in Parshat Vayechi, Yaakov wanted to reveal, he even says it, he gathers his sons together and says, come together, I will reveal to you what will happen in the end of days. That's a pretty amazing announcement. Yaakov is going to reveal all of history, and he's going to tell us what's going to happen in the end of days. And then in the Torah, he begins to give his children blessings. So everyone asks, well, what happened to the end of days? And so the commentaries explain that he wanted to reveal, but at that moment, the Shekhinah left him, the divine presence left him, and this prophecy was closed to him. So those are the two reasons that Rashi brings. On a deeper level, we can understand, what does it mean, a closed parsha? Parsha stuma. So the paradoxical idea here, the name of the parsha is Vayechi, and he lived. But what is most of the parsha about? Yaakov dying. And so in a certain level, different poems or literature takes this idea that from the moment we're born, we begin dying. Why? Because it's predetermined that every living thing, whether it's a human being or an animal or a tree, everything ultimately, anything that's alive ultimately dies. So we're all born into a closed portion, parsha stuma. In other words, existentially, the way the game is set up, the way the program is set up, is everything that lives eventually dies. Bob Dylan said in a famous line, "He who is not busy being born is busy dying." That's also this existential idea that we are bound in by the reality of eventually dying. And so this parsha is called, and he lived, and Yaakov lived. But again, it's all about his passing away. So that's a little bit on a deeper philosophical level why this parsha is called a closed parsha. And again, what that means in a technical sense, that there's no space between the previous parsha and this parsha. It's closed. So if we go one step further, the idea, not only does it say that Yaakov lived, but he lived in the land of Egypt. It never says that he lived in Israel. The word he lived, Vayechi, is from the word chai, l'chaim, to life. So it's a bit of a paradox that it was in Egypt that the Torah says that he was alive. So why is that? So one of the ways we can understand this is Yaakov, even though it was closed to him, the greater prophecy of what would happen in the end of days. He actually did see what was closed to him really was the permission to reveal it. And that's why when you go through the blessings that he gave to his children, and you look at Rashi and other commentaries, he hid in the blessings many of the things that would happen in the future of the Jewish people. That's a whole other discussion. But it was more that it was closed to him, the ability or the permission to reveal it so openly. And they ask, well, why? So some say if the Jewish people would have heard that from the time of Yaakov to now, 3,500 years would go by and still Mashiach would not be here, like people would like lose hope. So actually, in a sense, it was good that he didn't reveal how long it would take until Mashiach comes. Okay, so, and one other thing. So again, so what's this idea of living in Egypt? So Yaakov did see that it would be a long, long exile, not just in Egypt, but that exile would be a big part of Jewish history. And so he wanted to show that even in exile, we could be alive, we could live, we could survive, and we could even thrive and be fruitful and multiply and accomplish and all of that, even in exile. Even in exile. Some people point out he might have done too good a job because so many people are like very comfortable in exile. And like, why do I need to come to Israel? I have 4 kosher restaurants in my neighborhood, and there's a mikvah, and there's 7 shuls, and there's the federation, and like, what do I need? The bakery, of course, the Jewish bakery. What do I need to come to Israel for? I have everything I need here. So some kind of tongue-in-cheek say maybe Yaakov did too good a job of showing that we could live in exile. So that's our first example of a division. Here there is no division between 2 Parshiot, where there is in every other case. Okay, so our next example is going to be just one second. So this one is actually, yes, it's on the bottom of page 163. Okay, this is a very, very interesting one. And there are 4 people that God calls by their name twice. 4 people. 3 of them are in the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, and 1 is in the book of Shmuel, Samuel. Who are the 4 people? Moshe, and actually in this week's, well, actually last week's Parsha, at the burning bush, God calls Moshe, Moshe. Earlier, when Avram is taking Yitzchak to offer him, God calls him Avraham, Avraham. When Yaakov is coming down to Egypt, God calls Yaakov, Yaakov. And God calls the prophet Shmuel when he's a little boy, the famous story where he's in the tabernacle and he hears someone calling him Shmuel, Shmuel. And he thinks it's Eli, the high priest. And he goes to him and says, "Did you call me?" And he said, "No." And Shmuel left, and again he hears the voice. And Eli finally figures out that it's God who's calling Shmuel. Now, you will not see it in the Torah itself, but according to the Masoretic text, the tradition that we talked about before, in a printed Chumash or Tanakh, you'll see a fairly thick black line between each of the names. So when it says Avram, Avram, there'll be a black line. It's called a psik. Same thing with Yaakov, same thing with Shmuel. The exception is Moshe. When God calls Moshe, there's no line in between, no psik. And so there are many explanations. So when there's a division, it's called psik ta'ameh begaveh. There's an interruption in the middle. And by Moshe, there is no psik, there's no interruption. So it's given over that we know that of all of the prophets, the greatest of the prophets was Moshe. Moshe was the only one who spoke. The Torah testifies to this, peh el peh, mouth to mouth, or face to face. None of the other prophets does it describe that's the way God appears to them. And it's given over that Moshe received his prophecy through what was called a clear pane, like a clear pane of glass. Whereas the other prophets received it through what's called a translucent pane, somewhat frosty, somewhat blurred, clear, but somewhat blurred. And so here, the fact that God calls Moshe, Moshe, there's no interruption, there's no division between his two names, is pointing out the difference between Moshe and all the other prophets. The next example is in the 13 Midot Harachamim. And for those following, it's on page 165. This is also a very, very important one. The 13 Midot Harachamim begin Hashem, Hashem, Kel Rachum V'Chanun, etc. God, God, a God of mercy and compassion. The 13 Midot of Rachamim, the 13 attributes of compassion or mercy, is a very, very important part of the Torah and has been included in many different parts of the prayers. So if you look again, you won't see it in the Torah, but in a printed Chumash, there'll be a line, again, a psik, between Hashem, Hashem. There's a line. So there are many, many different explanations of why there is a division between these two names of Hashem. Probably the one that's given over the most and relates to the 13 aspects of mercy is that God is merciful on a human being before they sin, and God is merciful on a person even after they sin. In other words, God does not remove his mercy if a person makes a mistake. miscalculates, even does it on purpose. Now, obviously, we need to do tshuva. We need to acknowledge what we did wrong. But the idea is that in a pure sense, God is compassionate. And that is one of the definitions of this name, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh. We know that God is called by many, many different names, but the name Yud-Keh Vav-Keh is very associated with compassion and mercy. And so this line here is expressing, we might think God only has compassion if we do everything right. But here it's almost dafka. When do we need God's compassion more than ever? Is when we do things wrong. And either we don't realize it, or we need some time to fix it up. That's when God's compassion comes in. There's also the idea that there's two manifestations of this name, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh. One is God in this name is transcendent. There's an aspect of God that is above time and space and all description. And then there's an aspect of God that is immanent. It's called transcendent and immanent, meaning that God is active in the world, appears in the world, is revealed in the world. And there's a place where there's an aspect of God that is not revealed in time and space. And so there's a line here just to make us aware that there are these two aspects. But the transcendent is also revealed in the world, but it's not as apparent. It's not as apparent. Another explanation is one of the most important verses in Isaiah, which we use daily in our prayers. Every single day, a number of times, we quote this. And it has so much kedusha, so much holiness, that some of the times that we repeat this verse, it can only be done with a minyan. There are certain times in the prayers an individual says this verse, but there are other times that only if you have a quorum, a minimum of 10 men, a community, a congregation, can you repeat this verse? And what is it? Holy, I'll do it in English. Holy, holy, holy is the God of hosts. The whole world is full of his glory. Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzavakot, Maleh Kol Haaretz Kvodo. The whole world is full of his glory. Now, again, you'll see this in a siddur, in a prayer book, that after the first kadosh, again, there's a division. There's a psik. There's a division. Why is there a division? So we're told that there are different levels of holiness. And God's holiness is revealed in the world, is accessible, but there is a level of holiness that is unique to God. And so after the first kadosh, after the first holy, there'll be a division. There's a division. There's a psik to let us know that there is a certain level of kedusha that a human being can reach, but there is a certain level of kedusha that is unique to God. And the word kadosh itself, the root of kadosh, means to separate. So here it's very significant that in one of the most important verses about holiness, there is a division, there's a separation on a certain level between God's holiness and our holiness. And it's given over that the second and third repetition of the word holy, we're told that when we received the Torah at Sinai, right before that we said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. And the Midrash says, and it's in the Talmud also, that angels came and they placed 2 crowns on each person's head. One for we will do and one from we will hear. And some commentaries connected to these, the second and third kadosh of the verse in Isaiah of holy, holy, holy. The first holiness is uniquely God's, but the next 2 showing us that it is accessible, it is possible. We're told that after at least part of the Jewish people worshiped the golden calf, these 2 crowns were taken away. They were taken away. Now we're going to do 2 more quick ones, because most of this has been about these divisions according to the Masoretic text. But let's, for example, the word Pesach. And this, actually, there are hundreds of examples in the Talmud where a word is taken, and in order to understand a deeper level, the word is divided into 2 according to syllables. And this is to show a deeper level. So one of them, I don't think it's in the book here, but the Arizal said that the word Pesach, you could read it Pei Sach. Pei means mouth. Sach means to converse. So Pesach literally means to leap over. That's where we get the translation, Passover. Passover is a quite decent translation for Pesach. It means to jump over, to leap over, to pass over. But when you divide it by syllables, it has a very different meaning. The mouth converses. So this is relating to Pesach night, Seder night, because what text are we reading? The Haggadah. What does Haggadah mean? To tell. Lahagid means to tell. So what is the main mitzvah? There's 2 main mitzvahs in our day, at least. On Seder night, Pesach night, there's 2 mitzvah from the Torah. One is to eat matzah, and the other is to tell the story. So that's why the Arizal said in the word Pesach itself, if you divide the word, you get a deeper meaning. The mouth is telling over, because that's the essence of Pesach, is to tell over the story. A different example of divisions between words is that at Purim time, when we read the Megillah, so we read about about Haman being hung on the gallows that he had made for Mordechai, and his 10 sons were also hung. So the tradition is, when the person who's reading the Megillah, he should read the names of all 10 sons without taking a breath. There should be no division between saying it. That is quite a challenge for those who are familiar with hearing the Megillah. To say all 10 names without taking a breath is, it can be done, but it's a challenge. So they say, so what's the teaching though? Where did we get this custom? And so it can be explained like this. There's different types of, let's call it evil in the world. There's certain evil that can be dealt with a little at a time. And sometimes even within ourselves, that it's too much. And I don't even know if I want to use the word evil, but when we want to change our ways, let's say, to do it in one fell swoop is not always easy. Like to go cold turkey, whether it's an addiction or smoking cigarettes or going gluten-free or whatever it is. Sometimes it's not easy, just whoop, that's it. Fell swoop, no more of this. But at other times, the only way to deal with change or evil is to do it with one fell swoop. That many people, let's say smoking, they try to cut back, and sometimes for some people it works, for other people it doesn't work. The same thing with going cold turkey works for some people and not for others. So we're told that the type of evil that Haman and his 10 sons represent, they wanted to destroy the Jewish people for real. It's not just a story. They really wanted to commit genocide. They wanted to wipe out the Jewish people. So sometimes when you're faced with that kind of evil, you can't do it one little step at a time. So that's indicated in this custom of reading all 10 names in one fell swoop. Okay, so we don't have time to go more in this chapter, but I do want to point out that this one I brought from Pesach, from the Arizal, that this method is used very often by the sages. Well, they'll take a word and they divide it into two. They make a division in order to reveal a deeper meaning. So we got to a number of examples of divisions of words, verses. Again, for those who have the book, you'll be able to see. And Parshiot, how different Parshiot are divided. Now we are going to go to the musical cantillation. So this needs a bit of explanation. So remember when I mentioned that in the Talmud, there's a discussion about the division of verses. How do we know where one verse begins and one verse ends? There's also in the same Talmud a discussion about how do we chant the Torah. So I just want to explain that we've discussed many times this idea of Pardes. Pardes is learning the Torah on 4 different levels, and it's an acronym. The Pei of Pardes is for Pshat, the literal. The Resh of Pardes is for Remez, the alluded to, the hinted to meaning. The Dalet of Pardes is for Drosh. This is the allegorical, metaphorical, symbolic parable of the Torah. And the Samach is the secret, Kabbalistic, mystical meaning. So here, what's interesting is we went from below to above. There's another system that is also 4 levels. It goes from above to below. Those who have the book, look on page 169 and you'll see it right there. So here, the highest level comes first in this system, and that is what's called the ta'amim, or in Yiddish, the trup. This is the musical notes or the musical tradition of how we chant the Torah. After that, you have the vowels, the nekudot. Now, neither one of these appear in the Torah. Then you have the crowns on the letters, the tagin. Those do appear in the Torah. And then you have the otiyot. So that acronym is called tanto. But it goes from above to below, rather from below to above. But the main point why I'm bringing this here is in this system, the way that we chant the Torah is considered the highest level of interpretation. And this is the level of interpretation that is the most secret and the most hidden. And we're told that when Mashiach comes, he will reveal ta'amei mitzvot. Now here, it's the same word as the musical cantillation, the ta'amim. But in this sense, it means the reasons for. When it says Mashiach will reveal the ta'amei mitzvot, he'll reveal the deeper inner meaning of the mitzvot. But it also means that the musical cantillation that we chant the Torah, the Mashiach will also reveal the deeper meanings. And of all of the levels of learning Torah, of the literal, the hinted to, the allegorical, symbolic, metaphorical, parable, mystical, the most hidden is the meanings of these notes. Now, I should point out that if you go to different synagogues, Ashkenaz or Sephardi, or different Hasidic, or even among different Sephardim, the chanting you'll hear is very different. But the notes are the same. In other words, the Masoretic text tradition that was said 1,000 years ago. And again, if you open up any printed Chumash, you'll see the notes. Some of them are above the letters, some are below. That's the same for everyone. But the way that it's chanted, different communities have different songs, have different ways that they chant it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick out a number of examples and try to explain the meaning of some of these musical notes. But I do point out that in great degree, we're waiting for Mashiach to reveal, because on every word is a note. And we can't say that we understand completely why this note is on this word. Some of them we do. And that's what we'll discuss tonight. So the first one is at the bottom of page 169, a very fascinating one. This is one of the notes, it's called shalshelet. The shalshelet, if you look at my finger, looks like a spiral. It goes like 3 times. There's like 3 spirals in this note. And it only appears 4 times in the entire Chumash. Only 4 times does this note appear. So we're going to quickly go through when does it appear and see that there's a common theme to this note. So the 4 times, and just because of time, we can't go deeply into any of these, but the first time is with Lot. When the angels come and they tell Lot, Sodom is going to be destroyed, and take your family and leave. And we know the famous story that, and told, don't look back. And Lot's wife looked back, and however we understand it, she became a pillar of salt. Now this is happening down by the Dead Sea, which is also called the Salt Sea. But the the sons-in-laws of Lot, they didn't want to leave, and Lot himself was in great unsurety. What's happening here? So this note appears, and we'll see that in all four cases, it represents a state of unclarity, of doubt, of not knowing what to do. So the first one is by Lot. The second one is when Avram sends Eliezer to find a wife for Yitzchak. And in the Torah, Avram didn't explain to him exactly how to go about this. So he ends up in Haran. And he doesn't really know, how am I going to find a wife? How am I going to find Avram's family? And so he sets up this whole test. But part of it is Eliezer is in a state of unsurety. How do I go about this? So again, the shalshelet appears. The third time is, and this we could go into if we had the time, very, very deeply, is when the wife of Potiphar is trying to seduce Yosef. And Yosef refuses and stands up to her. And according to the text, it appears that he's like unshakable. In other words, he's not even has any semblance of listening to her. And yet in the story, the shalshelet appears in order to tell us that even though the text doesn't explicitly say it, it makes the test even greater. In other words, let's say Yosef is not tempted at all. So you say, well, what kind of test is that? He's not tempted. But Yosef is a human being who has desires, and there is a temptation here. His greatness is he refuses. But the shalshelet appears to tell us that this is what made the test so difficult. And the last time it appears is at the time of dedicating the the tabernacle. Aaron is feeling tremendous guilt and shame for having, not on purpose, but he thought he was stalling, but he got the people to give him all of his gold. He threw it in the fire thinking he was getting rid of it. But some people who knew magic made this golden calf come out. So he certainly had the right intention, but somehow unwittingly, he was part of making the golden calf. So when it came time to dedicate the tabernacle, he's supposed to be the high priest. He is in a state of deep existential unsurety that he's worthy to be the high priest. And for the fourth time, this sign appears, this shalshelet. And I'm gonna sing it for you so you can hear it, because there's nothing else like it. It's Did you hear that? There are three trills, and that represents a state of unsurety. There's no other note like this. And again, here is where we do have a tradition. This is what the note means, and this is why it's in these four places. So that's our first example. There are two places in the Torah, depending on how one's community chants the Torah, it's all the same. In other words, every note has the same musical intonation. There are two exceptions. The two exceptions is where the tune changes completely. And they're the same tune in two different places. And one is at the Song of the Sea. When the Song of the Sea is chanted, the tune is completely different. And the second time it appears is in the end of the book of Bamidbar, of Numbers, where the 42 journeys in the desert are recalled. Again, the exact same tune that is used for the Song of the Sea is used to go through these 42 stops and encampments in the desert. So one asks, well, what's the connection between these two? Well, both of them had to do with traveling, with leaving places and coming to places. To cross, we sang the Song of the Sea after we left Egypt, 7 days later, and we crossed the sea. That was the beginning of our journey. The end of the journey is when the 42 encampments are recalled, and they have the same tune. It's like the beginning of the song and the ending of the song. So here again, we in a sense, we know the reason, or at least that's one of the reasons. We could come up with other reasons also, that we change the tune. The next example we'll bring is a very, very important one. Very important one is the 10 Commandments. This is the only example in the Torah where if an individual is reading the 10 Commandments, he reads it in one way, meaning the musical notes and even the way that the verses are divided, he reads it in one way. But when it's read communally, the division between the sentences, the verses, and where we put the emphasis of the musical notes is different. And this is called the higher reading of it and the lower. This is on page 173. The higher one is called Tam Elyon, the higher way of reading this. And the other way is Tam Tachton, the lower way that we read this. And this is the only time in the Torah that this happens. And what it points out is how important the 10 Commandments are. That's like bottom line. Why do we have this two different ways that we read the same verses? And even make a division. That was what we learned in the previous chapter. The division of verses is actually different slightly when we read the public reading of the 10 Commandments. So I want to end with a story, a very, very beautiful story. And that is the founder of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, the Alter Rebbe. So he also would read the Torah every Shabbos. He was what's called the Baal Koreh. He was the reader of the Torah. And he was extremely careful to get every note correctly. And so he did this every year. And his son, who became known as the Mittler Rebbe, Dov Ber, who, when the Alter Rebbe died, he became the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. So one year when the book of Eicha was read, no, excuse me. In the Torah, in Parshiot Devarim, in Parshiot Ki Tavo, there are 98, we're going to call them curses. It begins with blessings. If you listen to God and you follow the Torah, you'll have all of these blessings. And if you don't listen to God and you don't follow the Torah, you will have all of these not so good things happening. Anyone who goes through these 98 curses and knows Jewish history will see that every one of them came true. Unfortunately, every one came true. So every year, the Alter Rebbe would read this parsha, and there's another tradition that we read it in a soft voice. Why? Because the custom is that the language is so harsh, and it's so hard to listen to, hard to read, that the Baal Koreh reads it softly and as quickly as possible, to try to get through it as quickly as possible, to indicate that, okay, it's in the Torah, we have to deal with it, but look, would it be that we don't have to deal with it? So, so Doron is just pointing out that when I think Monday night is the Alter Rebbe's Yurtzeit, this Monday night, the 24th of Tevet. So one year, the Alter Rebbe went away on this Torah portion, and someone else read it. And in the middle of the reading, the Midler Rebbe, who is still a relatively young boy, he fainted. In the middle of hearing these curses, he fainted. And everyone was concerned. They revived him. And the story is that he was in bed for weeks afterwards. In other words, hearing these curses affected him so much, it like wiped him out for weeks. His mamish sick. So later they asked him, they said, we don't understand. You heard your father read these for many, many years, and you never had a reaction like this. What happened this year? So he said to them, when my father reads the curses, all I hear are blessings. I only hear sweetness. I never really heard the curses, because the way he read it, all I could hear was sweetness and blessings. Remember, the parsha begins with many blessings. This time, it was like the first time I ever heard it, and it shocked me to the core of my neshama. So this is just a story about the musical notes and their deeper meanings. I started out by saying that he heard Eicha, the book of Lamentations. So there are certain books of the Tanakh that have their own way of chanting it. So just because I mentioned it, the book of Lamentations, the way we chant it is very sorrowful, sad, melancholy, painful, the way that we chant it, because that's the essence of what's been given over. And different books have different ways that we chant it. We can't go in deeper than that, but we'll end with a blessing. You know, we're talking about blessings and curses. We should only know blessings. And if there's anything in our life that appears like a curse, we should be able to turn it around and make it into a blessing. And also, the whole Torah is called a song. This we learn in Parshiot Ha'azinu, in the book of Devarim, that the song Ha'azinu, but it also refers to the entire Torah. the sages say the whole Torah is called a song. The whole thing is a song. So that's why the way we chant it is so important, because the whole thing is a song. So that should be our blessing. Our blessing is the Torah should always sing for us. We should always sing our Torah. Rabbi Akiva said, if you want to remember your Torah, he said, sing your Torah. Sing your Torah.